Hey guys, Mr. P. In this video, we're going to talk about cell respiration as an overview. So we're not going to get into the intricacies of the phases, but we're going to talk about what the phases are, what is the order of the phases. Cellular respiration is a fundamental process that occurs in the cells of living organisms where energy is released from glucose or other organic molecules to produce ATP. ATP, as you recall from previous chapters, is adenosine triphosphate, and so this chapter is all about how do we make ATP within the mitochondria of a cell. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the cell respiration equation. The cellular respiration equation states that glucose plus oxygen yields, which means produce, carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Now, this energy, this ATP energy, is the form of usable energy that the cell can use to do its cellular energetics and the cellular work. All of this energy is ultimately what we want out of every glucose molecule that we consume. Now, this is the equation. Glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide plus water plus the energy from ATP. If we balance the equation, it's one glucose molecule, C6H12O6, plus 6 of these O2 molecules, yields 6 CO2 molecules, 6 H2O molecules, and a total of 36 ATP. Now, again, focusing on the equation, we talk about how glucose comes into the reaction. Glucose is going to come into the reaction through our food, and so I will label it consumption. We consume food. We are heterotrophs, and I say we, humans, are heterotrophs, and so we consume other organisms. Those other organisms can be consumers themselves, or they can be producers. Either way, we get the food in through consumption. We then breathe in O2, so O2 comes in through inhalation. That's the first half of respiration. So we breathe in O2 from the atmosphere. O2 is one of the gases, or oxygen is one of the gases in our atmosphere. We breathe it in through our lungs. We consume food, so glucose comes in through our food, again, consumption. When we breathe in oxygen and consume food, we are going to convert all of those large, complex organic compounds into individual glucose molecules. We do that through the process of digestion. So we bring in all of these food molecules and we break them down into individual glucose molecules. Once we have individual glucose molecules that are assimilating into our tissue cells, they're going to be taken by our circulatory system, obviously blood, and are going to be dispersed among all the tissue cells within our body. We are then going to do that cellular respiration process. It means we're going to decarboxylize, and again, we'll talk about that when we get into the intricacies of the cell respiration process. But we're going to start pulling the carbons off of this large complex molecule, which is glucose, and we're going to release CO2 when we exhale, or exhalation. Again, that will be returned to the atmosphere, just like the oxygen was. Water vapor, too, will breathe out every time we exhale, or exhalation will be returned to the atmosphere. It's part of the water cycle. And so these two are products that will be produced as a byproduct. Energy, though, will stay in the cell and will be used to do cellular work. And again, that is the whole benefit or the whole purpose of this cell respiration process. Okay, so we've talked in depth about the equation, we've talked about the reactants and the products, and so we need to talk about the stages. Cellular respiration occurs in three main stages: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, which is also called the citric acid cycle, and the oxidative phosphorylation, or the electron transport chain, which we've always referred to as chemiosmosis. The three stages, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and ETC, occur in different areas of the cell, but they're all oriented around the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the organelle that is responsible for ATP production. So the first thing that happens in glycolysis is glucose, which is that C6H12O6, which we said started the entire chemical equation, is going to be broken down and converted into 2-pyruvates. Now, we're going to talk about the intricacies, like I said, in later videos, but if glucose is 6 carbons, meaning 6 individual carbons, we're essentially through this glycolytic pathway going to cut it in half, and you end up with 2 3-carbon pyruvates. So each pyruvate or pyruvic acid is going to contain 3 carbons each. Those are halves of the glucose. Those 2 pyruvates are smaller, and so they are therefore more manageable and able to penetrate the mitochondria through the membranes and enter the Krebs cycle. Now, the Krebs cycle occurs in the matrix, which is the fluid of the mitochondria. So inside this inner membrane is a fluid, kind of like the cytoplasm, which is out here, outside of the mitochondria, where glycolysis occurs. So glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Glycolysis splits glucose into 2 pyruvates. Pyruvates enter the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle occurs in the matrix. Once the pyruvates enter the matrix, they will be further decarboxylized into these things: ATP, NADH, FADH2, and CO2. Obviously, CO2 is going to be released to the atmosphere. It's one of those byproducts of cellular respiration. But NADH and FADH2, these 2 molecules in purple, are incredibly important in entering the next phase, the last phase of the cell respiration pathway, which is the chemiosmosis portion, so that ultimately we can make large amounts of ATP from those particular energy compounds. Now, this is an overview video, so there are a lot of metabolic processes that occur and a lot of intermediate molecules that are made from glucose to ATP, but we are just talking overview and we're just talking equation. So if I write the equation, C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus 6O2 yields 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus energy. With this diagram, we are looking at kind of a pictorial representation of this equation. Glucose starts here. Oxygen is brought in. It's not really part of this, but it will be fundamental in our electron transport chain because O2 is our final electron acceptor, which we'll talk about later. So glucose comes in, O2 comes in, CO2 is produced. You can see throughout the process that we're producing CO2, which is going to be released to the atmosphere. H2O is also produced and released to the atmosphere. You can see it here. And energy is made, which is the whole purpose of the cell respiration pathway, which is what we're getting out of the final stage for a net total of 36 ATP per glucose. And so there are 2 pathways that can happen while we are going through this cell respiration pathway. Now, we are aerobic organisms, we being humans. It is necessary for us to produce ATP. We want to keep our cells oxygenated. Our cells have to remain oxygenated or the cells that are making up the tissue will die. And so there are 2 pathways that we need to understand in order to fully understand this concept. When O2 is present, meaning when oxygen is present, it is called aerobic respiration. When O2 is not present, it's called anaerobic respiration. In normal times of normal oxygenation, we consume glucose. We move that glucose into all of our tissue cells. We convert that to pyruvate. We then take the pyruvate, move it into our mitochondria, into the Krebs cycle, where we produce a little bit of ATP, but we convert it into that NADH and FADH2 molecules that we talked about in that previous slide to move it into the chemiosmotic pathway to ultimately make large amounts of ATP. Now, in the presence of O2, when there is normal O2 saturation within all of our tissue cells, we are not only producing ATP during glycolysis, we're producing ATP during the Krebs cycle, and we're producing ATP during chemiosmosis. Remember, all of those combined, the ATP made during glycolysis plus the ATP made during the TCA cycle plus the ATP made during chemiosmosis produces about 36 total ATP per glucose. That is what we want. That is large amounts of energy that keeps our cells energized as we go about our normal day-to-day activities. However, if oxygen is depleted, or we lift weights, or we go sprinting, or we go swimming, and we're utilizing a lot of the oxygen and ATP stores within our muscle tissue cells, it depletes the O2 and therefore turns our pathway anaerobic because no more O2 is present. Again, O2 was used up, isn't replaced fast enough in our tissue cells. So O2 is depleted, meaning O2 is not available, meaning it shuts these pathways down, which turns the whole cellular respiration process anaerobic, meaning now it produces either ethanol, in the case of yeast, or it produces lactic acid or lactate in the case of lactobacillus, bacteria, or humans. If you work out or if you do something strenuous and you wake up the next day sore, that's because your muscle cells switched from producing ATP via aerobic respiration and started producing lactic acid in the anaerobic respiration due to the fact because you depleted your muscle cells of oxygen and you started producing lactic acid. Now, why do we even have this anaerobic respiration pathway? There will be a future video on anaerobic respiration in detail. However, for now, as long as you know that lactic acid fermentation or this fermentation or anaerobic respiration process is all about life preservation, meaning when oxygen is not available, we can sustain our life for short terms because we have the ability to produce lactic acid, which helps us to produce a little bit of energy in order to get us by until O2 is returned. What is the relationship between photosynthesis and cell respiration? They are exactly backwards in terms of their processes. Again, if we focus on the equation, C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus energy. That is the cell respiration equation. And if we were to switch the arrow, then all of a sudden it would be the photosynthetic pathway, right? Because photosynthesis, as you recall, is plants take in CO2 plus water plus light to produce glucose and oxygen. So these are inverse processes to each other. Chloroplasts are going to take in water. This is a reactant. They're going to take in CO2. They're going to take in light energy in the form of photons, and they're going to convert all of these reactants into the photosynthetic products, which are O2 and glucose. Chloroplast obviously being the organelle responsible for photosynthesis. Once the plant produces the glucose, consumers can then eat the glucose if they are consuming the producers, and that glucose can then be converted with the presence of O2 into chemical energy, and in the process produce the two byproducts of cell respiration, which are water and CO2. So you cycle this water, carbon dioxide, O2, and glucose so that we can consistently bring in light energy to produce chemical energy. Chemical energy obviously in the form of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. That's it for this video. If you learned something, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. We'll see you later.